Welcome to a special Friday the 13th episode of Haunted Talks, the official podcast of The Haunted Walk, offering thematic walking tours in Kingston, Ottawa, and Toronto, Ontario. My name is Jim Dean, I am your creative director, and I really appreciate you joining us for today's show. A very happy Friday the 13th to everyone. We hope you're having a very lucky day today. And in honor of this special occasion, we wanted to release a mid-month bonus episode. And it features our own Margo MacDonald, who is our longest tenured tour guide. So it's a good chance if you've been on a tour in Ottawa or Toronto, you may have had Margo as your guide. Now, she's also played a key role in our investigations and our research. So when we were given the opportunity recently to attend a very intriguing event, we thought Margo was the perfect fit to go and cover that for us. And I have a feeling this is the most unusual funeral she has ever attended. I'd also like to mention that we've also made a blog post from Margo's experiences at the event, which does contain some photos. So if you're interested in checking those out, go to hauntedwalk.com/news and look for her article entitled Stories Beneath Our Streets, From Discovered Remains to Remembrance, a really fascinating and surprisingly touching story. But before we get to that, we are in the middle of our Halloween season and things have been going extremely well. Great crowds, great weather, and there really is no time of year better to do a haunted walk than, of course, the Halloween season. We have special tours running every night in Kingston, Ottawa, and Toronto, and information about all our different experiences can be found at our website, hauntedwalk.com. Also be sure to follow us on Facebook, Instagram, Snapchat, and Twitter, all at Haunted Walk.
It's a Sunday afternoon in a small side room at the Canadian Museum of History in the nation's capital. Outside, it's sunny and hot, and the choppy waters of the mighty Ottawa River are sparkling. But inside, the atmosphere is a little more somber. I've come to pay my respects to the dead. Not anyone I know, per se, though I have been introducing them to people for the past 16 years. The forgotten and misplaced dead is how I refer to them when guiding the original Haunted Walk of Ottawa, here beneath our feet. Yet when human remains were discovered during digging for the Ottawa Light Rail transit system along Queen Street between Metcalfe and Elgin in 2013, most people were very surprised. Yes, says Ben Mortimer, senior archaeologist with the Patterson Group.
I say that it was unknown to everybody except archaeologists, history buffs, and people who had done the Haunted Walk tour of Ottawa.
A few years ago, when workers started digging for Ottawa's light rail transit project, just down the block here, the corner of Elgin Street and Queen Street, they were shocked to find human remains underneath the pavement. And while it was a surprise to those poor construction workers, it was certainly no surprise at all to the historians I work with here at the Haunted Walk. They know that where today we have office buildings at one time, this was all a very large graveyard. It extended 2 blocks this way and 2 blocks that way. It was surrounded by tall wooden posts, and it was divided into 3 sections, one for Catholics, one for Anglicans, and one for other Protestants. As we begin our tour tonight and our walk through this area, please remember those who built this city, after all. You may be standing on their graves, even now.
In 2014, the Patterson Group were brought in to conduct an archaeological survey of the area and then disinter the remains, handing them off to the Canadian Museum of History for analysis. Now, years later, the remains have been studied, the data collected, and they are ready to be reinterred, this time in Beechwood Cemetery. But first, a public visitation and a chance for today's citizens of Ottawa to pay their respects to some of the city's earliest settlers. I don't know what I was expecting, but it wasn't this. Perhaps I thought that, being in a museum, it would seem more like a museum exhibit. But it doesn't. Not at all. The moment you walk in the room, and see the small black wooden caskets laid out row upon row, you can't help but stand in silence for a moment and take it all in. Virginia, a visitor standing beside me, stops and raises her hand to her heart as she looks around. "This is surprisingly moving," she says. I agree with her. This isn't a museum exhibit. It's an actual funeral visitation, complete with guest book and classical music softly playing, and these unknown dead are being treated with as much respect as any honored dead might be. There are 52 caskets containing the remains of 79 individuals. Those remains which were originally found buried together will remain together. The caskets are small, some of them heartbreakingly so. They are made of pine, painted a dull black, with single brass nameplates tacked onto them bearing only a hand-stamped number. The team have researched Victorian funerary practices and have tried to match them as well as they could. Even the remains inside the boxes have been wrapped in muslin, reflecting the practice of the funeral shroud. Later, when the caskets are brought to Beechwood Cemetery to be reinterred, private burial services will be held with the same hymns, verses, and prayers the Victorians likely would have used when these dead were first laid to rest. "I like to think we are repairing a dignity deficit for these folks," says Paul Henry, chief archivist with the city of Ottawa. And indeed, these individuals and their remains have had a rough go of it. When the Barrack Hill Cemetery was closed in 1845, many of the buried dead were claimed by their families and reburied at the Sandy Hill Cemetery, which, by the way, in turn was closed in 1911, becoming MacDonald Gardens Park, and the bodies, well, at least most of the bodies, were moved again, this time to Beechwood Cemetery. Those left behind when the 2-acre Barrack Hill Cemetery was closed were probably those whose families did not claim them. But why? Well, perhaps they couldn't afford the cost. Perhaps they'd moved away from the area and never heard news of the cemetery's closing. Or perhaps, more than likely, the entire family had died of disease in one of the town's many early epidemics, and there simply was no one left to claim them. So there they remained, the town turning into a city, roads laid out and buildings built right on top of the forgotten cemetery. The archaeologists found evidence that as digging occurred in the area over the years to lay water mains or other services, it was clear that occasionally old burials had been disturbed, and many times remains were simply redeposited on site, mixed with fill, and so this resulted in a lot of small bone fragments, said Mortimer. Well, thousands of them, actually. All of these thousands of fragments, along with the intact remains, were sorted and examined by Dr. Janet Young, curator of physical anthropology at the Canadian Museum of History. Life for the early European settlers in the region was brutally difficult, and something that shows in their bones, she tells me.
We had 19 burials that were relatively intact, and interesting finds, health and disease through the years. Lots of indications that even the adults had gone through periods of childhood stress, physiological stress, so poor nutrition, bad health, and then for the adults, lots of cavities, very huge cavities. We know there were dentists in Bytown at the time, so it was obvious that these people probably couldn't afford it because it would have caused them a lot of discomfort, and yet, they weren't attended to. So things like that. We have one cause of death for the burials, and it was tuberculosis.
Of the 79 individuals recovered, 32 of them were children or babies. But who were they? Do we have any evidence as to their identities? The answer is not really, according to Mortimer, and this, he says, points to the socioeconomic status of these individuals. These families are families who don't have a lot, he says, so they're not going to bury someone with anything that can be reused, like garments, shirts, and shoes. We found no evidence of footwear in any of the burials, he tells me, and I take a moment to wonder why I find that so sad. Well then, apart from the bones, just what did they find? A few buttons, some hairpins, lines of straight pins down the center of torsos, most likely indicating the individual had been wrapped in a shroud of muslin or cotton, which was then pinned closed, and a few copper nails, which had clearly held nameplates onto coffin lids at one point, but the nameplates had been removed before burial, most likely by grieving parents wanting a final keepsake of their child. And the coffins themselves? It's true that one of the things I expected to see here today were the original coffins from the intact burials I'd heard they discovered. But it turns out an archaeologist's idea of intact is a little bit different from mine.
Part of what we found, so part of our process was the burial site investigation. That was our first year on site, gathering as much information about the burials that were there, proving that they were still in their original resting place. So we saw everybody was on their back, in what we call the supine position, standard Christian burial practices, head to the west, somewhat in rows, and in wooden coffins. The coffins, while they were still visible, were completely collapsed and pancaked onto the remains. So the remains and coffin, in every instance, were maybe 5 centimeters to 10 centimeters thick from top to bottom kind of thing. They're really squished down. The wood was more like a thin layer that you could peel off. It really wasn't intact per se. It had completely disintegrated, and sometimes it was only visible through a trace of a brown line through the sand. When we got through that kind of material, you could see quite often it'd have a coffin lid, but it had formed to the skeleton in its resting position.
Looking around the room, I feel a sense of relief that these individuals have been found and given some sort of identity, even if it is just a number and a detailed scientific report. Chief Archivist Paul Henry agrees, saying it's more of an identification than they'd had before, lying forgotten beneath the city street. Do you believe in ghosts? I ask him. Well, that's the question, isn't it? He replies. But since I believe an archivist deals with ghosts every day, I don't press him. He does tell me, however, that there has been no haunting activity associated with the remains, that all has been peaceful, and we agree these lost dead must simply be relieved to have been found and acknowledged. But wait, have they all been found? The consensus amongst the experts is no. These remains were found on public land, but there were some recently found on private land in the area, and those remains are now being analyzed. Dr. Young tells me she fully expects more remains will be found, and so they're still monitoring as more excavation work is being done in the area. So it seems it's fair to say that although many have now once more been laid to rest, some of the forgotten and misplaced dead still lie beneath our feet as we guide our tours through the busy streets in the old Berwick Hill Cemetery site, only 1 block away from Parliament Hill.
A big thank you to Margo MacDonald for sharing this extraordinary piece. I hope you enjoyed it as much as I did. Thank you to David Lone, our tour guide you heard in the episode, to Kevin MacLeod at incompetech.com for the additional music, and to Michelle Dennis, our outstanding audio editor. A very special happy Friday the 13th, or a fist bump or a paw bump to little black cats everywhere today. It is your day. I hope you enjoy it. For information about our Halloween season, be sure to visit hauntedwalk.com or follow us on Facebook, Instagram, Snapchat, or Twitter, all at Haunted Walk. Until we meet again, sweet dreams.